I am going to be talking about women and mothers in the role in educating children, in particular girls. And if you don't mind, I'll be standing while I'm doing this. My area of expertise, actually, is philosophy and gender studies. So today I'll be talking mostly about women. And when Abdullah came to ask me to give this presentation today, I was very honored, obviously, and very excited, but also a little scared because it's a little outside of my domain. Oh, the mic, sorry. When I was doing the research for this paper, or for this presentation, I started looking at the statistics. And the statistics are overwhelming, both in terms of the numbers that are out there, the sheer kind of gender disparity that happens economically, socially, culturally, in terms of education, and I got overwhelmed. I'm not a statistician, I am not a numbers person. I am somebody who does think about the relationships between power, structure, and society, though. So I decided I was going to look at what happens when we educate women in terms of the family and in terms of girls. And if any of you are TV junkies like I am, if you remember the show, The Heroes, there was a saying, save the cheerleader, save the world. I'm kind of taking off of that, educate the girls, save the world. So if we start out by talking about the statistics that I saw, and like I said, I was overwhelmed by these. These statistics are somewhat, how shall we say this, in terms of gender parity in education, less than ideal. And this is especially so in particular regions of the world. Just to take a snapshot of these numbers. There are still 31 million girls of primary school age out of school. Of these, 17 million are expected never to enter school. There are also 34 million female adolescents of secondary school age out of school. And this one I thought was quite challenging. 2/3 of the 774 million illiterate people in the world are female. And these statistics I gathered from places like UNESCO and the Millennium Development Goals Fund, etc. Now, I would gather that we can all agree that these statistics, by any metric, are tragic in many ways. But we need to ask the question of why. Why are they tragic? So, a lack of access to education or denial of that education has long-lasting multi-generational effects, not just for girls and women, but for entire nations, both socially and economically. Not only is it a waste of potential human capital to deny so much of the population a chance to participate in society, but the real-world impact of this denial has unconscionable material consequences. High rates of maternal and infant deaths, malnutrition, poverty, and the continuation of preventable childhood diseases can all be seen as part of the direct ramifications of girls' and women's lack of access to education. From here, the story gets a little more complicated. Higher rates of domestic violence, gender wage gaps, and overall economic stagnation all can be seen as part of the indirect results of the lack of access to education for girls and women. The complications here arise from the way in which we look at issues and concerns with regards especially to developing countries. In the last decade and a half, we have seen a shift away from single-issue methods and concepts in the way in which international development agencies, scholars, and policymakers approach the subjects of poverty, education rates, and access to healthcare. Instead, yay on this point, there has been a concerted effort to understand how modes of race, class, gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, language, etc. develop and overlap one another and together contribute to creating impediments to better standards of living. This comes as no surprise to those of us who've been involved in the discourse of social justice over the last 40 years or so. Many groups and thinkers, and in particular feminists, have taken looking at the concept of intersectionality and where and how these issues of poverty, class, gender meet up in people's lives. Simply put, intersectionality looks at how axes of identity and specific components of social and economic groupings interact on multiple levels in an interrelated constellation of power structures that construct systems of discrimination and oppression. And I'm going to give a definition, hang on. I have here a working definition. So if we look at the idea of intersectionality, we can think of it as a concept which explores the various ways in which gender, race, class, age, other axes of identity interact to form structural, political, economic, social, cultural, and representational aspects of the dominant forces acting on people's lives. In other words, it is not enough to tackle single-issue concerns such as gender or class. Rather, we must attempt to understand and thus bring better solutions to problems through more thorough and larger frame perceptions of the interrelated nature of these issues. So now we've kind of expanded this, right? We've gone from just looking at one gender issue and going to look at race and class and other axes of identity. And we've, in doing so, kind of complicated what needs to be improved. And we might be tempted to see these problems as insurmountable, given that it's so large. I would argue, however, this would be to understand the situation from a very static perspective. In reality, the matrix of power structures is in itself a dynamic entity. In other words, it changes over time and through concerted effort. Therefore, attempting to better even one component can begin to improve the entire system. Thus, for instance, expanding access to girls' education produces better educated women and mothers, which then allows for future generations to have better standards of living, which also ultimately contribute to helping economies to develop faster in these nations. I want to look at specifically the role of women in educating children to attempt to understand how intersectionality would function. We are all fairly well aware that women, by and large, are the primary caregivers of children. Global statistics vary, putting the time that women spend on childcare at 50 to 70% more than men. As such, they take on the role of providing the vast majority of the responsibility for creating the home environment in which children are raised. One of the deeper meanings of this division of labor is the idea that the private-public divide is heavily gendered, where women are, more often than not, limited to the private sphere. And if you've ever taken a class with me, you know that I talk extensively about the private versus the public sphere. I say limited here because without the necessary tools such as literacy and skills training, women's participation in either the political sphere or the formal economic labor sphere becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for many. And again, we ask, why is this important? Why should we care? Here's what we do know about the benefits of educating women. Fighting extreme poverty. Studies show that women will and do reinvest up to 90% of their income back into the household budget. This means that children with mothers who have external incomes will be better fed and are more likely to attain higher levels of education themselves. Eradicating malnutrition. Because women will reinvest that money back into the house, right? If all women had a primary education, 1.7 million children would be saved from stunting from malnutrition. If all women had a secondary education, 12 million children would be saved from stunting from malnutrition. Lower rates of maternal mortality, most often related to complications during pregnancy and childbirth. If all mothers completed primary education, maternal deaths would be reduced by 2/3, saving 98,000 lives. In sub-Saharan Africa, if all women completed primary education, maternal deaths would be reduced by 70%, saving almost 50,000 lives. Lower rates of infant mortality. If all women had a primary education, there would be 15% fewer child deaths. And if all women had a secondary education, child deaths would be cut in half, saving 3 million lives. Reducing the number of child-age marriages. If all girls had a primary education, there would be 14% fewer child marriages. And if they had a secondary education, there would be 2/3 fewer child marriages. Why am I telling you all this? Because the numbers are staggering. And the input that's required to make this better isn't as large as we think it is. And I want to emphasize how important it is that we give access to education for the intergenerational effects that bloom and blossom over time. So these are but a few of the projected statistics on the direct benefits of educating girls and women. The indirect benefits, although more complicated, are just as important to consider. This is especially true when you consider the impact of girls and women's education on entire nations. Even one extra year of schooling in a girl's life will increase her income by 25%. And this not only impacts those families specifically, but also raises the nation's GDP as a result, thereby helping to lift their communities and their countries out of poverty. International development agencies, aid groups, scholars, and policymakers have been promoting the importance of global access to education for children for decades. Given the statistics that we've just gone through, we can see how important it is to keep girls in school. Not only do these endeavors help particular individuals and their families, but the intersectionality of these power structures also change for the better as a result of these measures taken within these nations. However, this is necessary not only because of the practical issues at hand in terms of being a means to an end of bettering everyone's lives. We ought to do it because it is the right thing to do to give everyone, girls and boys, access to what I would consider a fundamental right of contemporary life, the right to have an education. It is groups like Fad Violence that allow us to contribute in some small way, all of us, to making the world a better place for all right now, and just as significantly for future generations as well. Thank you.
Thank you.